November 21st, 1999. Stores across Japan opened to lines of customers ready to purchase the latest title from the phenomenon known as Pocket Monsters, or Pokemon for short. In less than 4 years, Pokemon had become a worldwide hit, spawning a trading card game, an animated series, a feature film, and a plethora of merchandise. Game Freak, the developers who created and designed the first set of games, had their work cut out for them. For their sophomore outing, they would have to deliver a product that not only surpassed the original, but showed the world that Pokemon wasn't just a fad. Everything has a story, and in this series we'll cover the development, release, and cultural impact of Pokemon Gold and Silver, and how Game Freak created a follow-up to a phenomenon. In the late 1980s, Game Freak, a small self-published magazine centering around arcade games in Japan, made a monumental change. They decided to no longer write about video games, but instead, they were going to create them. Satoshi Tajiri, who had been the writer for the magazine, would head this new studio and later go on to create Pokemon. Alongside Tajiri was Game Freak co-founder Ken Sugimori. Sugimori had been the illustrator for the Game Freak magazine. Tajiri would begin laying the groundwork for a new game that centered around catching bugs in the early 1990s. The idea would eventually morph into Pokemon. Tajiri served as director for the game. Sugimori was the art director and had the task of drawing and finalizing the monsters that would inhabit the game. The vision for Pokemon was large, and a long development was needed for the game. Game Freak needed funding, and the best way to do it was to develop new games for a variety of different game consoles. One of these games was Yoshi, a puzzle game released for the NES and Game Boy in 1991. The title would mark the first time Game Freak would work with Nintendo, who would go on to be the publisher for the Pokemon titles. Game Freak would work with Nintendo again to create Mario and Wario, a 1993 Super Nintendo title that never released outside of Japan. Both titles would be directed by Satoshi Tajiri. The relationship with Nintendo offered Game Freak their most valuable resources, funding, and the creative expertise of Nintendo's brightest minds. With their relationship evolving, Tajiri and Game Freak pitched the idea of Pokemon to Nintendo. Nintendo was hesitant to go forward with production, but did so due to Game Freak's reputation as a developer and Tajiri's experience in directing games for Nintendo. Shigeru Miyamoto, the legendary game developer who created Mario, Zelda, and a host of other Nintendo series, would even step in and mentor the young Tajiri, but it would take 6 long years for Pokemon to go from an idea to a fully fledged title. February 1996 would mark the beginning of Pokemania, when Pokemon Red and Green launched in Japan for the Game Boy. The titles were an instant success in Japan and helped revitalize the declining sales of the Game Boy. Despite releasing on outdated hardware, critics praised the title, and it's still considered one of the greatest games ever made by many. Players loved the titles as well, as stores sold through their stock quickly. Part of the reason for Pokemon's success was their use of the Game Boy link cable to battle and trade Pokemon. These features helped sell more copies of the games, as some players would purchase both Red and Green version to catch 'em all. A third version of Red and Green would be released in October of 1996 called Pokemon Blue. Originally only available through a mail-order promotion, the title would fix glitches and bugs seen in the original release, while also featuring updated sprites for the various Pokemon. Combined, Red, Blue, and Green would sell a total of over 10 million copies in Japan by 1997. Alongside the growing media franchise of trading cards, manga, and an anime, Pokemon had taken Japan by storm. Nintendo and Game Freak would even come together with Creatures Inc., another developer who helped with the development of Pokemon Red and Green, to create the Pokemon Company to handle all of the various licenses and promotions in April of 1998. North America would be a different story. At least Nintendo assumed it would be. They invested $50 million to market Pokemon Red and Blue before they released in September of 1998, a few weeks after a localized version of the Pokemon anime began airing on American television. Just like in Japan, the titles would be a massive success, selling just shy of 10 million copies. Other regions would receive Red and Blue throughout 1998 and 1999, often accompanied by the various merchandise, shows, movies, and books the franchise had been building up. Red, Blue, and Green were worldwide hits, and it spawned a massive media franchise. But fans quickly began to notice that there were more Pokemon showing up, and they weren't available in the colorful cartridges made for their Game Boys. From the very first episode of the Pokemon anime, a rare and unknown bird Pokemon was seen flying away to lands unknown. New Pokemon were out there, but it would be a while before gamers had a chance to capture them. In 1997, Nintendo announced that new Pokemon games would be coming out at the end of the year, titled Pocket Monsters 2 Gold and Silver. The games were meant to release on the Game Boy and would feature Super Game Boy compatibility. 100 new Pokemon would make an appearance in the title, many of which would be related to the already established Pokemon and evolutionary lines. New items, TMs, HMs, locales, and characters would appear in the game as well. New Pokemon would continue to pop up after the official announcement in the anime, Pokemon movies, trading cards, and spin-off games. From November 21st to November 23rd of 1997, Nintendo would host their annual Space World events. These were massive showcases of Nintendo products and games, similar to E3. The 1997 show was rather underwhelming, but there was a star on the show floor. An early build of Pokemon Gold and Silver was playable for fans. The demo itself was very short, only lasting around 10 minutes, and it was somewhat unimpressive given that the titles were still early in development. What this demo did have was tons of unused content that was cut from the final release of Gold and Silver. Due to the timing of the event, there was little footage or pictures taken during the time. Pokemon had yet to reach a worldwide audience, and the internet was still in its infancy after all. The demo would become a lost relic of gaming, with only rumors and the occasional blurry photo to detail what the demo contained. That is, until recently. In May of 2018, a full ROM of the demo was made available over 20 years after Space World 97 took place. The demo revealed the planned 100 new Pokemon for Gold and Silver, over 30 of which would never make it into the game. Many of these cut Pokemon were pre-evolutions to Generation 1 Pokemon, and some would be used later for future Pokemon designs. Some Pokemon would receive redesigns before the final release. The demo also gave a look at the world of Gold and Silver. This world was much larger, and was influenced by all of Japan as opposed to a singular region. However, the games were far from complete. 1997 would come to an end with no new Pokemon games releasing. Despite the massive success of the original Pokemon games, Game Freak was struggling monetarily. They had spent 6 years creating the first Pokemon games while working on other projects. This long development time had left the team unprepared to begin work on a sequel. Development for Gold and Silver would begin shortly after the release of Red and Green in Japan. The team set their sights high as they began working on the game. Game Freak wanted to create a sequel that was much larger in scope, and for some developers, they had hoped to leave the series behind and begin working on something new once Gold and Silver had released. Game Freak would continue using many of the methods of production as Red and Green. However, the success of Red and Green had prompted Nintendo to release the title overseas, and Game Freak was brought on board to help localize the titles. Game Freak was also tasked with helping in the production of another title coming to the Nintendo 64, Pokemon Stadium. Game Freak would receive help during this time from the legendary Satoru Iwata. Iwata was serving as the president of HAL Laboratories, a developer with a close relationship with Nintendo. Iwata also served on the board of Creatures Inc. Iwata stepped in and looked at the battle logic for Red and Green, which the teams at HAL and Nintendo were trying to transfer over into Pokemon Stadium. Iwata was able to analyze the code, without any sort of documentation to guide him. He was able to study and port the code within a week, shocking the developers at Game Freak. 1998 would be a massive year for Pokemon, thanks to the release of Pokemon Red and Blue in North America. But Game Freak had been crafting yet another version of the original Pokemon releases behind the scenes. Pokemon Yellow would release in Japan in September of 1998, and would be released in other regions throughout 1999 and 2000. The title was an enhanced port, and would feature updated battle mechanics and sprites. The story was also altered, as the game would take more influences from the anime, including the inclusions of characters from the series, and a Pikachu that would follow the player outside of its Pokeball. But where were Gold and Silver? The titles had been missing in action for a while, but in the April 1999 issue of Koro Koro magazine, they resurfaced. No longer were the games releasing on the Game Boy, but they would be coming to the new Game Boy Color. The games had received a number of changes, most notably the lack of a 2 in the title. Various Pokemon and gameplay elements from earlier builds were cut or redesigned. The region of Gold and Silver was significantly altered as well. Rather than taking place across all of Japan, Gold and Silver's Johto region would see inspiration from Japan's Kansai region. Major cities like Osaka and Kyoto would serve as the building blocks for much of the game's story and lore. New details of Gold and Silver would be revealed throughout the rest of 1999 through various gaming magazines and news outlets. The titles would once again be featured at Space World 99. Gold and Silver had more playable demo stations than any other game at the event, and the developers at Game Freak claimed that the newest entries in the Pokemon series were 90% complete. Both games were coming close to their final release date. Pokemon had become a global phenomenon by 1999. A popular TV series, a high-grossing theatrical film, multiple manga adaptations, a trading card game, merchandise as far as the eye could see, and of course, the games. Nintendo was already considering Pokemon one of its most important franchises at this point. Pokemon was receiving multiple spin-off titles on the Game Boy and Nintendo 64, and popular characters from the series like Pikachu and Jigglypuff were appearing in Nintendo titles like Super Smash Bros. For Gold and Silver, Nintendo set their sights high by ordering 30 million copies of the game for the Japanese launch, and estimating that the titles would sell over 8 million units in Japan alone. Unfortunately, an earthquake in Taiwan would push back the production schedule, and Nintendo would only have 1.5 million cartridges available in Japan for the release. Even with a shortage of copies available, Gold and Silver were a huge success in Japan. Both titles released on November 21st, 1999, over 3.5 years since the release of Red and Green. Together, the two games would sell more than 6.5 million copies in Japan within the first 6 months, barely outselling Red and Green within the region. And what a sequel it was! Gold and Silver were massive improvements over the original titles. The upgrade to the Game Boy Color paid off, as these titles popped even on the tiny Game Boy screen. The 100 new Pokemon all felt original and welcoming alongside the original 151. New features like the day and night system added a sense of believability to the world of Pokemon. The story would serve as the groundwork for the rest of the series, with a massive focus on the legendary Pokemon Ho-Oh and Lugia. Gold and Silver introduced two new Pokemon types, Dark and Steel, to help balance out the typing advantages and disadvantages that the first game suffered from. The music. Oh, the music. You've been listening to it throughout this series, and I find Gold and Silver to have one of my favorite soundtracks in the Pokemon series. All of this managed to be created on decade-old Game Boy hardware. The titles even featured a condensed version of the Kanto region that served as the basis of the first games, thanks to the compression tools that Satoru Iwata had created. To say the least, Pokemon Gold and Silver were masterpieces. The rest of the world wouldn't have to wait very long for Gold and Silver. North America would receive the titles on October 15, 2000, and Europe would receive a release in April of 2001. Critical reception was high in North America for the sequel, with Gold and Silver receiving numerous high scores, including the at the time rare 10 out of 10 from IGN. Sales were great as well. Gold and Silver smashed the fastest selling games record for its first week, when it sold 1.4 million copies. The previous record holder was Pokemon Yellow, which managed to sell 600,000 units, less than half of Gold and Silver's total. In all, Pokemon Gold and Silver would sell an astounding 23 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling games of all time. The success of Gold and Silver would cause a new wave of Pokemon media and merchandise to flood the market. New spin-off games, most for the Nintendo 64, came out after Gold and Silver, including the well-received Pokemon Stadium 2 and the microphone-based title Hey You Pikachu. New seasons of the anime, new movies, new cards in the Pokemon trading card game, and millions of new toys were released based on Gold and Silver. Game Freak wasn't done with the games just yet. In December of 2000, Pokemon Crystal was released exclusively on the Game Boy Color. This new enhanced port would feature the option to play as a female protagonist for the first time in the series, animations for the various Pokemon, a battle tower, and a brand new story focused around the legendary Pokemon Suicune. In Japan, the title would come with the mobile adapter GB, a device that allowed players to connect their Game Boy to their mobile phone to interact with other players. This device was the only way players could obtain the mythical Pokemon Celebi for years to come. Crystal version would release in North America in July of 2001, only a month after the release of the Game Boy Advance. This wouldn't stop Nintendo of America from promoting the game. They would even release a special Game Boy Advance bundle with Pokemon Crystal. Critical reception in the States was still positive, but many noted that the new features weren't enough to some who had already enjoyed Gold and Silver. Crystal wouldn't sell as well either, only seeing a modest 6 million units sold worldwide. For some, this would be the last Pokemon game they played, as the new titles would release on the Game Boy Advance and begin to cut ties to the past games. It would be the beginning of the end of Pokemania, as sales for the series began to decline. Pokemon has remained popular since the release of these titles, but only on occasion has it reached the mainstream success it saw during this time period. After the release of Gold and Silver, Satoshi Tajiri handed off directorial duties of the Pokemon series to Junichi Masuda. Masuda joined Game Freak as a composer in 1989. He had also taken on the role of a programmer once his compositions were complete. Masuda would serve as the new face for the Pokemon series going forward. He has directed every mainline Pokemon title since the release of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire in 2002. Tajiri, and much of the old guard at Game Freak, have taken more executive positions in the company since, letting a new generation of developers grow and cultivate the ideas that these legendary developers planted many years ago. The impact of Gold and Silver should not be understated. While the mainline Pokemon games are often regarded as great titles, none receive quite the same love as Gold and Silver. The games are frequently cited as some of the best Game Boy games ever released, and to some, they're some of the greatest video games ever made. Many of the features from Gold and Silver would be carried on to future Pokemon titles, helping set precedents for the series. For me, Gold and Silver represent my introduction to the Pokemon games. While I was introduced to Pokemon through the anime, my first time with the games would be with a copy of Pokemon Silver. I recall visiting a neighbor's house sometime in 2003 and playing a copy of Pokemon Silver on a Game Boy Advance. I loved being able to use the Pokemon I'd seen in the anime and on trading cards in battles. I wasn't very good at the game due to my lack of experience with the series and games in general. At one point, I recall one of my Pokemon becoming poisoned, and I freaked out when the screen started to flicker every few steps. I thought I had corrupted the game or maybe even broken the system. Eventually, I whited out somewhere between the second and third town in the game. But I was hooked. I would receive my own Game Boy Advance a few months later. I would spend most of my time with Pokemon Ruby, but I never forgot my origins. Sometime in the summer of 2004, a friend of mine would give me a copy of Pokemon Crystal, so I could explore the Johto region in full. Unfortunately, I no longer have that specific copy of the game, but I'll never forget those memories that I made. Gold and Silver would receive updated remakes in Japan in 2009 on the Nintendo DS, under the titles Pokemon Heart Gold and Pokemon Soul Silver. The games featured updated graphics and features that had been present in Pokemon games released over the past decade. The new titles would bring their own new features alongside these returning features as well. A new route and Safari Zone were added to the game. An updated Pokedex allowed some new Pokemon to be captured before beating the champion, and for the first time since Yellow, any Pokemon could follow the trainer throughout the overworld. The remakes would come with an additional device known as the Polka Walker, a pedometer that connected to the Nintendo DS system. You could transfer your Pokemon to this meter and walk around with them, gaining experience, items, and capturing new Pokemon. The games would release throughout the rest of the world in 2010, and they were massive hits. Critical reception was incredibly high, and the title sold a combined 10 million units, landing them on the best-selling Nintendo DS games list. I love Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and consider them some of the best Pokemon games in the series. Unlike the remakes of Ruby and Sapphire that would come a few years later, Heart Gold and Soul Silver feel like returning to Johto in true form, and they came at the perfect time. For the kids who played Gold and Silver when they were released, many of them were in high school and college when Heart Gold and Soul Silver came out. While I wasn't super into Pokemon around the time Heart Gold and Soul Silver released, I did pick up the titles and played through them multiple times over the years. They're excellent remakes by adding just enough new content to keep older players interested, while also retaining what made the originals so great. In September of 2017, Pokemon Gold and Silver would be re-released on the Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console for all regions. Pokemon Crystal would come shortly after in January of 2018. The Virtual Console re-releases would update the original slightly by adding online play and Pokebank compatibility. For the first time ever, Pokemon caught in Pokemon Gold and Silver could be transferred to newer titles on the Nintendo 3DS systems. The re-releases would even see a physical box copy released with downloadable codes inside of them, signifying the importance of these re-releases. Pokemon Gold and Silver had a lot to live up to. Despite the sky-high expectations, the games were a success and made Pokemon into the franchise it is today. It's hard to say where or what the series would look like if Game Freak had rushed out a sequel or scaled back their original vision. Since then, the series has grown to have more than 800 Pokemon across a total of 7 generations and over 30 mainline titles. Pokemon Gold and Silver hold a special place in my heart as well. While I never got to experience the titles during their heyday, I still call Johto home, alongside the Hoenn region. The games are still being discussed to this day, thanks to the unearthed content found from the game's various builds and betas. We all owe a great debt to Game Freak, who went the extra mile in crafting Gold and Silver. I've seen countless stories from gamers when they discuss their first impressions of Gold and Silver. Whether it be encountering their first new Pokemon, fighting a legendary Pokemon, discovering Kanto was in the game, or even fighting the game's ultimate boss, Red. Sure, Gold and Silver have some problems, they aren't perfect games, but they changed Pokemon for the better. The story of Gold and Silver is that of the legacy it left behind, not just affecting me, but many, many gamers. Thanks for watching this series. If you would like to know more, please follow the link in the description for a list of sources and a short note about the making of this series. I would like to thank the various gaming outlets who helped create this series, including IGN, Game Informer, Nintendo, Bulbapedia, and the Cutting Room Floor. Without these sites and companies, I would not have the material to research to make this video. If you would like to support this series, you can do so by sharing this video. Leave a comment on what you would like to know the story of, and be sure to subscribe so you can catch the next video when it comes out. And once again, thank you for watching.